Thank you for your interest in this course on analyzing queues and processes. Before we get started, I wanted to review the course topics and also describe some of the things that I assume that you know about Excel. We're going to look at service times and waiting, and that will be in queues, or as Americans like to say, lines. And the idea is that you will take averages, average values, and do a numerical analysis of a queue. So you're not looking at specific circumstances. We'll do that in the second part of the course. The first part will just be modeling it and getting an overview, an average or a summary. Then we will simulate a business environment, and those will take care of business processes. So these two topics are related, but you will see that they're a little bit different and can apply in different situations. I will also give 4 business cases to solve, so that will be practice. I'll use the techniques that I show you in chapters 1 and 2, and I'll run through it fairly quickly, but of course you will have access to the previous chapters so you can look back and see what it is that I'm doing. And finally, in the last chapter, I will show you how to analyze and assess your data, acquiring business intelligence, and also give you an idea of resources that you can use in the forms of LinkedIn Learning courses that I've created and books that I highly recommend. So with all that in mind, what do I assume that you know about Excel? Well, I assume that you're comfortable with Excel, that you can create formulas, that you understand how absolute and relative references work in formulas and so on. I review it, but it's a lot easier if you know it. You can follow along with the exercise files that I provide, and you can pause if you want or speed up if I am going too slow. I speak at a moderate pace because many of the people who take my courses don't have English as a first language. They're comfortable in it, and they're very easy to understand, but it's always difficult when you're not working in your first language. I found that out last year when I was in Switzerland in the French-speaking part, and my high school and 2 years of college French, which I have forgotten over the last 30 years, were not nearly enough. And finally, I want to let you know that I have entered some of the more complicated formulas for you. One of them especially is quite long and complex, and I went ahead and just entered it for you and entered it as text so that you can see it before I remove the apostrophe at the start and turn it into a formula. I've done the work for you, but you will be able to see the formula in PowerPoint and then see how it's implemented in Excel. And with all that in mind, I will go ahead and get going with the analysis of processes and queues. Queues, which Americans tend to call lines, indicate how long it takes individuals to move through a process. The classic example is customers at a sandwich shop, but any scenario that involves possibly waiting for a limited resource can be represented as a queue. In this movie, I'll show you how to describe queues and mention the type of queues that we cover in the course. Queues have multiple characteristics that can be described using Kendall's notation. One element is the inter-arrival time, and that is how often items are added to the queue. So that could be customer arrival times. Next, the question is how long it takes to serve each customer, and that's called the service time. Then there are the number of servers, the system capacity, and the service discipline, which is a fancy way of indicating how you will serve the customers that arrive. First in, first out, by some sort of priority system, or whatever. There are many possible combinations, but we will use the simplest, and here's what that looks like. We'll be using one basic type of queue with a few variations. The inter-arrival time is exponential, and that's indicated by the letter M. We will use the Poisson distribution, which I'll describe in more detail later. The service time is also exponential, except instead of using Poisson, we will be using the exponential distribution. One is the inverse of the other. The number of servers will be 1, 2, or 3, and you'll see when we work with queues that does change our calculations significantly because of the variability. We'll assume system capacity is infinite and that service discipline is first in, first out. So these last two assumptions are probably not realistic, and actually an infinite system capacity is definitely not realistic, but they allow us to simplify our assumptions and get started with our analysis. You'll see these types of queues referred to in the literature as MM1, MM2, and MM3 queues. And again, those are the types that we will use in this course. One of the fundamental measures for any business resource is its utilization. That is, the percentage of time it is in use and not sitting idle. In this movie, I will show you how to measure the utilization of resources in a business process. There are two scenarios we need to take account of. The first is when we have one server, and the second is when we have more than one server. When we're analyzing one server, we need to know a couple of things. The first is the average arrival rate. So for example, you might get 6 customers an hour at an office that has some walk-ins but isn't very busy. You also need to know the average service time. This will allow you to calculate the number of customers that you can service each hour. So if you have 6 customers arriving every hour, but you could take care of 8, then you would divide your lambda, which is the arrival rate, by the service time to get the utilization indicated by the Greek letter rho. And in our case, 6 divided by 8 would be 75% utilization. Here's what that formula looks like. So we have rho equals lambda divided by mu. For multiple servers, it's almost exactly the same. We need to know the arrival rate, the service time, and again, those are both averages. We're trying to summarize the system, not model it closely. And you also need to know the number of servers, which is the letter S. And we divide lambda by S times mu to get utilization, which is rho. And here's what that looks like. The only difference is that we are multiplying mu by S, which again is the number of servers. And that makes sense. If we have one server that can handle 3 people per hour, and we have 3 of them, then we would have 3 servers times a capacity of 3 each per hour, and that would give us 9. With this information in place, we can switch over to Excel and perform our calculations. Here in Excel, I will work with the sample file named Chapter 1 Movie 2 Utilization. And I have 2 columns set up, one for a single server and one for multiple servers. I'll start by creating calculations for the single server case, and then after I do one, I'll move to multiple servers. So I'll start with the arrivals per hour in cell B5, and that will be the number of minutes in an hour divided by the arrival interval in minutes. So in B5 equal 60 divided by the value in B4, which is 10. So 60 minutes, 10 minutes between on average. I should see 6, and I do. And I'll do the same thing over in column E. That will be equal 60 divided by E4, and enter. Looks good. And the arrival rate, or lambda, which we'll use throughout the rest of this chapter, is 1 over the arrival interval in minutes. So in B6, I'll type equal 1 divided by B4, and enter. We get 0.1. That's 1 over 10. That's correct. And we'll do the same thing for E6. So equal 1 divided by E4, enter, and there we go. And customers served per hour will follow a similar pattern. So in cell B8, I'll type equal, and that will be 60 minutes in an hour, divided by the average service time in minutes. That's in B7, and enter, 7.5. And we'll do the same thing in column E. So in E8 equal 60 divided by E7, 7.5, great. And the service rate will be 1 over the average service time in minutes. So that's 1 divided by B7. There we go. 1 divided by 8.125, correct. And then in E9, we'll do the same thing for column E. So that will be 1 over E7. Enter. Looks good. And now the difference begins. Utilization is our lambda, or arrival rate, divided by the service rate, or mu. So in cell B10, for the single service case, I'll type equal, and that will be B6 divided by B9, and enter, 0.8, that's great. Now for utilization, we need to multiply the customers served per hour by the number of servers. So intuitively, it makes sense that we should expect the utilization for 2 servers to be 1/2 that of the utilization for a single server. So in cell E10, I'll type equal, and it'll be our lambda in E6 divided by the quantity of the number of servers in E3 multiplied by the service rate mu, which is in E9, right parentheses, and enter, and we get 0.4. And our intuition was correct. Utilization for 2 servers is exactly 1/2 that of the utilization for 1. After you measure a queue's utilization, you can calculate the typical values describing its performance. In this movie, I will show you how to calculate the average length of a queue. So, average queue length. For 1 server, you need to know the utilization, which is rho. You divide utilization squared by 1 minus utilization, and this is what that looks like. So you have the average length of the queue, indicated by L sub q, equals rho squared divided by 1 minus rho. So that is what it looks like for the average queue length if you have a single server. For multiple servers, it's a little more complicated. And I'm not going to lie to you, it's a lot more complicated. The formula is the probability of 0 individuals being in the queue, which you see indicated top left as P sub 0, is multiplied by the factors you see there, lambda to the power of the number of servers divided by mu, multiplied by rho, divided by the quantity of s factorial, so if s were 3, that would be 3 times 2 times 1, multiplied by 1 minus rho quantity squared. So where does P sub 0 come from? And this is where it gets really complicated. I'm not going to try to summarize this formula verbally, but what I will tell you is that I have already created the formulas for P sub 0 and average queue length for multiple servers in Excel, so you don't have to do it. You might need to change a few things if you implement it on your own, but you can use the base that I've created for you. So, what do you need to know? The average arrivals per hour, which is lambda, average service time, which is mu. That will give you the utilization, which is rho, also the number of servers. And when we're calculating P sub 0, n is a counter variable from 0 to s minus 1. So with all of that in place, let's go over to Excel, and I will show you how to calculate average queue length for a single server and then also for multiple servers. Here in Excel, I'm using the sample file Chapter 1, Movie 3, Average Queue Length. Over on the left, I have the case for a single server, and we'll look at multiple servers in a second. For the single server, the formula is fairly straightforward. We just square the utilization and divide it by 1 minus the utilization. So in B11, which I have already selected, I'll type equal, and then the utilization is in B10, caret 2 to square it, and then divide it by 1 minus the utilization, so B10, and enter, and we get an average queue length of 3.2. Now we can look at the multiple server case, and I'm going to scroll over to the right so we can see the entire support calculations. So everything else is the same, except that we need to do 2 separate calculations, and the first is that there is the probability of 0 people in the queue. So in cell E11, you can see that I have a space for that, but but I need to do a couple of support calculations first. Thinking back on the PowerPoint, this is a summation, and it is to n, or rather s minus 1. So s is the number of servers. We start counting at 0, and then we go up to 1. And that is s minus 1, so that's where we stop. I have implemented the formulas that I showed you before in cells H3 and H4. And I've done that so you didn't have to watch me struggle through it and make a lot of mistakes. So in H3, I will double click to edit the cell, and then I will remove the single quote that I put at the front to have Excel render the contents as text instead of a formula. So with H3 edited that way, I'll press enter, and we get a value of 1.192. And again, this is not a probability. It can't be. It's greater than 1. Instead, it's just something we'll use in our support calculation. Now I'll do the same thing in H4. And the only difference between those two calculations is that in this formula, I am raising the first term here to the power of the value in G4. And I'm also taking the factorial of the value in G4. When I was looking at the support calculation in H3, I was using the value in G3. So I'll go back to H4 and remove the single quote and enter, and there is my completed support calculation. Now, to take the probability that there is a 0 in the queue, I will take the sum, which you can see here in H5. I just used an auto sum formula to create that. I'll go to E11, type equal, and the value is 1 over the calculated value from H5, and enter. So we get a probability. There are 0 people in the queue at any random time of about 46%. And that makes sense. We have more servers than we need and utilization below 0.5, so it makes sense that we won't have people waiting very often. Now for the average queue length, we can use the formula that I've already entered for you in cell E12. I'll double click that cell and remove the single quote at the start and enter, and there we go. So the probability that there are 0 people in the queue at any one time is 0.46, and as part of that calculation, we see an average queue length of about 0.16. In the previous movie, I showed you how to calculate the average length of a queue, given that queue's characteristics. In this movie, I will show you how to calculate the average number of customers in the system, which includes the queue and customers being helped. So to calculate the average customers in the system, we can distinguish between a single server and multiple servers. For one server, you need to know the utilization, rho. And then you divide utilization by 1 minus the utilization, and here's what that formula looks like. You have L, average customers in the system, equals rho divided by 1 minus rho. For multiple servers, it's a little bit more complicated, but not much. You need to know the average queue length, which we calculated in the previous movie, and the utilization, again, rho. And here's what you have. The average number of customers in the system is the average queue length plus the utilization, or rho. Now let's switch over to Excel and show how to implement those calculations in a worksheet. Here in Excel, I will work with the sample file named Chapter 1 Movie 4, Average Customers in the System. I have carried over all the calculations of the previous movie, and all I need to do is calculate the average customers in the system for the single server case and the multiple servers case. They are 2 different calculations, although they look similar in this particular scenario. So in cell B12, for average customers in the system with a single server, I'll type equal, and this will be utilization, which is B10, divided by the quantity, so parentheses of 1 minus the utilization, and enter. And I get an average number of customers in the system as 4. So we'll have an average queue length of 3.2, and then average customers in the system of 4. Now we can do the same thing for the multiple server case with 2 servers over in column E. So in E13, and remember I had to move down a level because I had the support calculation for the probability of 0 in the queue. So in E13, I'll type equal, and that will be E10, which is the utilization, plus the average queue length, which is in E12, and enter. So you can see here that I have the average number of customers in the system of 0.5628, and that is the utilization plus the average queue length. With all the previous calculations in place, we can now calculate the average time that customers will spend in the queue and in the system. To calculate the average wait in the queue, we will use the same calculation for single and multiple servers. Basically, we will divide the average queue length by lambda, and remember that lambda is 1 over the arrival interval. And here's what that formula looks like. The average time in the system will again be the same for single and multiple servers, and all we'll do is add the average time in the queue and the average service time. There are more complicated ways to do it, but because we have performed all the other intermediate calculations, we don't need to worry about them. We can just add those 2 times. This is a gift to ourselves after calculating the average queue length. That wasn't too bad for a single server, but for multiple servers, it did require some work. With all that in mind, let's switch over to Excel and implement these formulas. I've moved to Excel, and here I have the sample file Chapter 1, Movie 5, Average Time in System. And again, to get to that, we need to calculate the average time in the queue and add that to the average service time. So for the single server case in B13, the average time in the queue, I'll type equal, and this will be B11, which is the average queue length, divided by B6, which is the arrival rate, and enter, and I get average time in the queue of 32. And for the average time in the queue over on the multiple server side, that will be in E13, or excuse me, E14. That will be equal E12, the average queue length, divided by E6, the arrival rate, and enter. And we get average time in the queue of 1.628. Now for the average time in the system, I'll go back over to the single server case in B14, and that will be equal the average service time in minutes, that's in B7, plus the average time in the queue, that's B13, and enter. And we get an average time of 40, and we can do the same thing over in column E for multiple servers. So that will be the average service time, and that is in E7. And we'll add that to the average time in the queue, which is in E14, and tab. So we have average time in the system for 2 servers of 9.63 minutes, basically, and average time in the system for 1 server of 40. So you can see that even adding a second server to a highly utilized process, in this case utilization of 0.8, it makes a big difference in customer satisfaction.